All right. Hi, guys. Good evening. It's evening now while I'm recording this. And you get to see one whole chair's worth of my living room for this lecture. This one will be much shorter than the last one. With the subject-verb agreement, we had 5 concepts to cover. And this time we're talking just briefly about Edgar Allan Poe's writing style. Now, today in class, I had originally intended to introduce the Edgar Allan Poe assignments that we'll be doing for his portion of our Gothic American Literature unit. That said, this lecture is not going to present all those assignments. We'll go over those in class on Monday. But one of the assignments, the largest of the two, is to choose an imitation of Poe in some fashion. You either can do a parody of The Raven, in which case you'll be imitating Poe's poetic style, or you can write a short story that imitates his style. Now, Poe is most known for his subject matter, that he tends to write about crazy people and about violence and scary stuff. He is, after all, the first American writer that really feels like he's writing horror. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's around at the same time, writes some stuff that's a little bit dark, and Washington Irving has a story in our textbook about a guy going into the woods and meeting the devil. I think the character's name is Tom Walker. But Poe is the first one who really seems focused not just on unpleasant things, but on communicating the unpleasantness of those things in a very visceral manner. So, he's most famous for his themes: violence, loss, sadness, madness. Okay. That said, that doesn't tell us a lot about his style, or the way he communicates. So what is it about a Poe short story that makes it a Poe short story? Poe is known for writing using a number of techniques very prominently. One is the use of the first-person narrator. Not all his stories, but most of his stories are told in the first person. That is, the narrator is active in the story as a character, normally the main character in Poe's case. And this is what happens in The Cask of Amontillado, in Telltale Heart, and in one of the 2 stories you'll be choosing from in class, The Fall of the House of Usher. This allows Poe to get up close and personal with the emotions of his characters, particularly of the narrator. And so it puts the reader up close and personal with some very disturbing people, and disturbing people who are feeling and thinking and doing some disturbing things. Remember, in our introductory lecture for the Gothic chapter, we said that Poe was interested in really extreme situations because he believed that the real person is the person that shows up under pressure. So he came up with crazily hyperbolic ways of putting his characters under pressure. Live burials, torture, etc. The first person narrator is a very effective way for him to show that to us. So, first person narrator. Another thing that he uses is the unreliable narrator. That is, many times he shows us really quickly that we can't trust what the narrator is saying. The classic example that all of you will know is The Telltale Heart. The narrator spends the first half of the story telling us, "I'm not mad. No, really, I'm not crazy." But the effect is to tell us 100% this dude is psycho. Okay, so it becomes very clear to the reader, to the audience, that he is crazy. And the more he protests, the more we are certain that he is crazy. So by having an unreliable narrator, especially one that we recognize quickly as an unreliable narrator, Poe increases the suspense for the reader, and he leaves us in a state where we're questioning what is real and what isn't. We're kind of lost ourselves. We don't know for sure what to do. The narrator's our guide. We can't trust them. What do we believe? Well, it forces us to make decisions for ourselves. Just like when you're talking to a person in real life, you have to judge based on their mannerisms, based on their tone of voice, whether or not you can trust them. Especially if you're just meeting them the way we are just meeting these narrators when we open the story. So, technique number 1, first-person narration. Technique number 2, unreliable narrator. The third technique we're going to look at is that Poe writes in a very rhythmic fashion. Now, when we're talking about his poetry, you will see that he never does the free verse thing. As a matter of fact, Poe is as far from free verse as you can get. He even chooses he doesn't just choose a rhythm and a meter. He chooses very complex and specific meters, and he is almost nursery rhyme-like in his insistence on never changing the meter. Okay? The Raven is pages long, and Poe changes the meter maybe twice, 3 times in the whole poem. So this clappable rhythm, very strict rhythm that he uses, is very complex and is very typical of his poetry. As a matter of fact, he was so known for the beats and rhythm in his poetry that Emerson very famously called him the jingle master, as if he were writing songs or jingles like you see on commercials. In addition, in poetry and prose, Poe layers on the description really, really thick. The only person who I've seen who spends more time using similes and metaphors to describe things is Shakespeare, when he starts really describing stuff. And similar to Shakespeare, these long descriptions in Poe can sometimes leave the modern writer feeling a little confused or frustrated. But if you want to write in Poe's style, you include tons of sensual details, meaning details communicated by the 5 senses, and you use lots of figurative language, lots of simile, lots of metaphor, lots of personification. Just shove it all in there. That's how you imitate Poe. Another thing that Poe does with almost all of his narrators is they are speaking to us as if they're telling us the story, and they talk to us in the audience. They might ask a rhetorical question or other things, and so it's a very conversational narration. And he likes to make the dialogue or the speech of the narrator, not that they're the same thing, the dialogue is one, the speech of the narrator is the narration. He likes to make it very emotional. As the story gets more intense, the person telling the story will get more intense. And often this means that he starts shortening his sentences and they get choppy, and there are lots of dashes and the thoughts get choppy and jumpy and moving back and forth. And this is a means that Poe uses of showing an intensification of energy or emotion for his characters. Now, as you work through Poe, if you pay attention, you'll notice a number of other things that he does. He loves to use big words. If he can pull out one fancy word that a normal person would communicate with a phrase or a clause, he will do it. Poe is someone that when you're first exposed to him, you probably want to read with a thesaurus, at least, if not a computer, handy, so that you can look up words that you don't know. There are going to be some. There are still some, when I read him, that I don't know. And I've spent a lot of time doing this. The man had a tremendous vocabulary, and he liked to show it off. So if we're imitating Poe, you might try pulling the thesaurus out and looking for fancier alternatives to some of the simple words that we naturally use to spice up the story a little bit, to make it a little more Poe-like. Returning to poetry for just a second for our last element. See, told you it'd be shorter than the subject-verb agreement. The other thing that Poe does, in addition to rhythm, is all kinds of sound effects in his poetry. He loves to use alliteration, which is the repetition of consonant sounds. A good example of alliteration that's not Poe is any tongue twister you can think of. She sells seashells by the seashore. That repetition of S and SH are each an example of alliteration. Poe also uses assonance, which has nothing to do with the body part, but deals with the repetition of vowel sounds. So if you go with Peter, Peter, Pumpkin Eater, Peter, Peter, Pumpkin Eater had a wife and couldn't keep her. Okay, now, when we look at that, not only do we have the P's and T's of Peter and pumpkin popping out all over the place, we also have the long vowel sound E over and over again in that line. So you have both alliteration, the consonants, and assonance, the vowel sounds. Poe loves to use both. The other sound effect that he makes heavy use of is lots and lots and lots and lots of rhyme. Okay, and he uses all kinds of rhyme. The kind of rhyme that we are familiar with is called by poets and English teachers end rhyme, because it shows up at the end of the line. And normally when we talk about a poem that rhymes, we mean a poem that has a pattern of end rhyme called a rhyme scheme. And so every line rhymes at the end, or every other line rhymes. They can set them up in lots of ways. Poe will also use internal rhyme, which means he has two words or more within a line of poetry that rhyme with each other. And sometimes, like in The Raven, you have two words that rhyme with each other in one line, in the middle of the line, and at the exact same spot in the next line, you have two more words that rhyme with each other and with the words from the middle of the line above. So he has very complex rhyme schemes as well. Sound is a big deal to Poe. You know what? I take it back. Rhyme is not the final one. The other one that he uses very, very well is onomatopoeia. Okay? Onomatopoeia is using words that mean what they sound like. For example, the word buzz. Buzz means this sound. Bzzz. Buzz, okay, represents a sound. If we say slap or clap or pow or bam or slam, all of these are onomatopoeias where the word is written to imitate a sound that accompanies, that the word represents. All right, so in this Poe unit, at the end, the larger assignment of the two, the one that's not in the textbook, will be to write either a short story or a poem that is imitating Poe's style. Now I've given you a double handful of techniques that Poe uses that you can borrow in order to make your story or your poem more Poe-like. We'll talk about this a little bit more in class, where we'll talk about some of the specific assignment details. And there is a page in your textbook as well as this video that talks about some of these things towards the very end of the section on Poe. But that's it. I'm done with this lecture now. So thank you guys. See you Monday.